You are listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
Welcome to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast. I am your host, Tim Hampton. My unusually well-informed guest today is Dr. Egbert Edelbroek. Egbert is the CEO and founder of SpaceBorn United. When humanity permanently settles beyond Earth, there will be a first generation of us born in space. Today, Egbert and I are going to discuss his work exploring the challenges of human reproduction in Earth orbit and beyond. Egbert, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here.
For me as well. So let's talk a little bit about the conditions in space. What makes human reproduction in space such a challenge?
Yes, many things. It's always about radiation and gravity. And it's important to understand that reproduction, it's not just one thing. It consists of different stages. So the conception stage, the early embryo development stage is completely different from the months to follow. And of course, the delivery part is a different stage as well. So we look at the different challenges from the perspectives of stages of reproduction. And for example, conception, vulnerable small cells developing into embryos. Then radiation is really important, but also gravity. And actually, we need to learn what gravity is necessary for healthy embryo development. All we know is Earth gravity and microgravity. And microgravity isn't helping, so it must be close to Earth gravity, probably.
Right. And what is SpaceBorn, your company, SpaceBorn United's role? Are you investigating human reproduction in space? What does your company do?
Yeah, we focus on three areas of work. First of all, we research the conditions indeed for human reproduction in space. And obviously we build on top of all the large research that has already been done by many agencies and research institutions. So that's the first step, doing research. And the second step is we translate the outcomes of that research into a missions program, a separate mission for each stage of reproduction. So the name SpaceBorn is obviously a hint for our long-term mission, childbirth in space. But for the next few years, we are focusing on the start of reproduction, so conception and early embryo development. But that's only the second thing what we do. The third thing is also important. We translate the research outcomes into biomedical devices required for the missions in the missions program.
And how did your interest in this subject develop?
Yeah, that's well, to some people maybe a funny story. How many years ago is that? Some 10 years ago, I decided to be a donor, a sperm donor for IVF clinics. And in that role, I learned more about assisted reproductive technology, such as IVF. And I always had a passion for space exploration. And that's where the both of them combined. And I started wondering more and more if this technology could also be re-engineered to work in space, because humanity is going to need something like this. Yeah. Or at least they should explore the options of assisted reproduction in space. That's where it started.
Well, and that is, as I explored the subject, I'm almost embarrassed to admit that I didn't think of this being a subject, but then I've known of our ambitions to settle the moon and Mars or O'Neill cylinders in space. And people have talked about it being a one-way trip, but if it's a one-way trip, probably you're going to want to have a family. So it is something that seems to me inevitable that will come up over time. You raised the topic of IVF. Could you say what that means and what that technology does?
Yeah, so it's part of assisted reproductive technology, and on Earth, IVF clinics usually help couples that have challenges of becoming pregnant in a natural way. So there are artificial assisted technologies that can harvest the female cells, the oocytes, look which of them are have the best chance for reproduction, and they can do the same for sperm cells. And that is one of those examples of technologies, and the fertilization of those cells can happen outside the natural womb. So that's an example of IVF technology.
Let's return to some of the challenges in space. You began with focus on gravity, which does seem like a very fundamental thing. A 3D printer, the way one is designed on Earth, will fail in orbit because it'll just, it can't, there's nothing to stick to. There's nothing holding things in place. Yeah. One can imagine similar challenges with life growing in space. But the other challenge seems to be radiation, and there's multiple kinds of radiation. What concerns can we have about that?
Very big concerns. In outside the Earth atmosphere, we're not protected by the atmosphere. If you go further on journeys to Mars, you're also outside of the Earth magnetosphere, even less protection. I mean, if you're going to the moon, that's also going to be an issue. So those are big issues, and there are multiple approaches being explored by hundreds of research institutions to deal with it. And one is the obvious approach to look at shielding, making sure that the radiation doesn't get to human tissues, but some of that radiation will just pass through space stations, etc. So real protection would require a couple of, I think it's 15 feet of water to get the heavy iron, to get that real protection that we have on Earth, the same level. So there are also other approaches, even more exotic approaches where where humanity, in fact, is looking at even genome editing technologies, that we can learn from evolution from other species that are better protected, and we might borrow their genes and build them into the human genome. But that's really exotic, and there's a lot of ethics involved, and that's going to take a couple of decades. But I predict that's going to happen eventually, for sure. And a lot of approaches in between, even lifestyle or diet habits, food interventions can enhance the radiation resistance of our cells, and even human hibernation technologies are being explored in a really serious way, even by agencies like ESA, to slow down the cell metabolism during long journeys. So there's a lot of research in tackling this, and we will use those solutions for our missions as well.
That's intriguing. I hadn't thought of the idea. I had, obviously, anybody who watches science fiction is familiar with the concept of sleeping the time away between stars or planets.
Yeah.
But I hadn't thought of it as a mitigation measure for radiation damage. So I guess the principle there would be that the Xerox machine isn't running quite so fast, and so it doesn't reproduce the errors that would be encountered while you're in transit.
That's one of the key reasons, indeed. Yeah.
So let's talk a little more basic, and there's male fertility, female fertility. So how is male fertility affected by space travel? I mean, they've certainly examined astronauts very carefully. They don't necessarily advertise that they're asking about sexual health, but I'm sure it's on the list. Is there any experimental evidence that male reproductive health is affected by time and space?
It is negatively. And radiation is also quite a serious issue. So there are even approaches to address this that Well, I know a little bit more about female scenarios, because if women travel to Mars, but also the same thing will be true for men. The reproductive organs, they are being compromised by all that radiation, and even in a way that they might not be able to reproduce anymore. So that might imply approaches that we store human embryos, and small volumes obviously are much easier to protect. So it's even a scenario where reproductive organs will be removed on Earth, cryogenically preserved in small volumes, and then well protected travel with them to Mars and then place them back. But that's quite
Yeah, that you might have a hard
Yeah.
time getting volunteers for that mission. One thing that I'm curious about is the ovulation cycle. In my limited understanding, is impacted by the lunar cycle. What happens when that is disrupted? Do we know anything that comes from that?
I personally don't know what is going on with that cycle, and how that is disturbed. We are, as I mentioned, we are focusing more on assisted reproductive technology. So we are facilitating embryo development outside of the human body as
Right.
one of the areas of solutions for these kinds of phenomena.
And so do you imagine a future where Earth's exports would include embryos as opposed to the people on Mars being able to reproduce on their own? Is that sort of what you're thinking would happen?
I think it's one of the it's a feasible scenario we expect. There are a lot of solutions, it seems, in that area. So I would say yes.
So again, because you're more focused on the technology, maybe this isn't a good question either, but just to complete the set, if you will, the gestation in space. I know that your company has looked into the concept of an artificial womb, but do we know anything, even with animal experiments or something along those lines, of what gestation in space is like, what carrying a baby in space is like?
Yeah, the biggest bottleneck is gravity. So developing embryos need a certain level of gravity for healthy development. Already after 5 days, it's crucial when the young embryo starts splitting into different kind of tissues: bone tissue, brain tissue, muscle tissue, etc. So also gestation inside an artificial womb, it would at least need to be in an environment where there is artificial gravity to some level.
Some sort of centrifuge or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's going to be one of the big issues. I mean, radiation can be addressed in different ways, the protection, but gravity, and that's what we are. That's the key scientific value, actually, of what we are doing in our current focus. We can study affordably, close to Earth, low Earth orbit, what level of gravity is required for healthy embryo development. Maybe the Mars gravity level is enough. Mm-hmm. Most experts have serious doubts about it, but we can find out. We can learn this inside our space incubator.
Right. So just to complete the set then, we have birth in space. Do you know how important gravity is to that process?
Yes. I know. I've spoken to several experts in obstetrics, and they expect it's not going to be necessary at all. It can happen in microgravity. It's about, also on Earth, about 90% of the requirement is from the muscles in the body, and gravity, yes, it helps a little bit for the last 10%, but it's we could easily do without. And
Right.
to stay on the safe side, we will facilitate childbirth in space only with women that have given birth before. So the second or the third time is usually a lot smoother than the first time. So then gravity is even less of a factor.
But I think one of the challenges there is somebody who is a permanent inhabitant in space could have their musculature with her, right? So that would be one of the challenges, because it is a muscular activity, giving
Yes.
birth.
That's completely true.
I
mean, maybe it's good to get that clarified. Our childbirth mission that we are aiming for, it's only 24, maybe 36-hour mission. It's not a mission where we have a woman in space for 9 months. It's just the delivery.
And that's one of a series of experiments you're contemplating. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the experiments that SpaceBorn is thinking of taking?
Yeah, sure. So the first mission that we are preparing is about conception and early embryo development in low Earth orbit, and that's like a 5 to 6 day mission. An unmanned mission, so it's IVF in space inside a small embryo incubator, inside a recoverable biosatellite. So we allow the conception to start in low Earth orbit, and then we allow the embryos to grow for 5 days just before they start splitting into different types of tissues. And we want this to happen in normal Earth-like gravity. Yes, artificial, obviously. And then we examine, of course, we will first have validation missions using animal cell samples, testing the prototypes, etc. But eventually we should one day move to doing this with human embryos. And to pause their development after 5 days, we use cryogenic technology, the same that is applied in IVF clinics, to so to speak, to freeze them, and to pause their development, and also to protect them for all the vibrations during the recovery phase, the re-entry through the atmosphere. And then inside IVF labs that will be examined for all the health criteria. So that's our first focus for the next couple of years. We call the mission ARTIS, Assisted Reproductive Technology in Space, ARTIS.
ARTIS, okay.
And meanwhile, we are also working on the childbirth mission. It's hard to say when that will happen, because that also depends on different developments. We need a really comfortable flight, so low G profile spacecraft, and the space tourism industry seems to provide more and more options for such flights. So we're going to use those developments, and that might mean that in about 15 to 20 years we can do this mission. But still, that depends on a lot of research that needs to be carried out, and also comfortable spacecraft for vulnerable people, obviously. And meanwhile, we are looking at different experiments. We are closely monitoring the human artificial womb. Actually, in the Netherlands, there's a group that got a large grant to re-engineer the animal version into a human version, but not with the intent to make it work in space. That's going to be another step. But as I mentioned, we see a lot of opportunities for such technology to become a multiplanetary species and protect a growing embryo better than the human body would be able to.
Right. I think you'll forgive the term cross-pollination, right? What you learn on Earth, you can learn in space, and vice versa. They can be applied in both locations.
Exactly.
So some of the experiments do have ethical implications, but then also sending people to live for generations on another planet has its own ethical dimensions, right? What will happen to their children? Will the children thrive? Will they be safe? Will they mutate somehow? Will they continue to be like humans on Earth? And so I can see the motivation for doing these kinds of experiments. Is there a body, or are there? I imagine one of the problems is there's probably 1,000 government bodies and agencies that are interested in this. Where would you go to get clearance to undertake these missions?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. There's a lot of ethics involved, usually translated in legal regulations, and there are big differences for different regions. You can imagine, for example, Germany, they have very strict rules. They would never want to be associated with stuff that's happened in the Second World War. So for that reason, they have very strict rules for anything that could be labeled as an experiment with human cells or embryos or people. But there are other regions that are more open to these required innovations. And there is indeed hundreds of different bodies, and there is collaboration. I think there should be more collaboration. But there is hope, because I mean these life science issues, they're ethically delicate, and it's very difficult. For example, for the agencies, they work with taxpayer money, so it's very difficult for them to address these life science challenges. But they're open to it. They're open about it. They explicitly encourage focused biotech companies like ours to address these topics, because, well, if you look at NASA, for example, also ESA, well, I think it's 90 to 95% focused on engineering, building solid, advanced spacecraft, and also a little bit habitats. But the life science issues, I mean, it's marginal, and well, there are going to be people inside these spacecrafts and space habitats and stations and O'Neill cylinders. So that area needs a lot of focus and effort, and it's growing because it's essential. We can't send people to Mars if we didn't address many of those issues.
Yeah, I mean, the alternative to thinking these things through, and I mean, we can think and do research on Earth all we want. Nothing quite beats an experiment under the conditions we're contemplating. But if we send 1,000 people to Mars, there's going to be a baby born, right? Like, it's going to happen, whether it's sanctioned or not. And so the more we know in advance, I think it is definitely valuable. You touched on the subject of, I don't know if you use the term exactly, but gene manipulation. Mm-hmm. You know, I think we can agree that we adapted to the conditions of Earth. If we're going to thrive on Mars, we may need to either select people who have the characteristics we learn are beneficial on Mars, or to create those beneficial characteristics. And that gets into another fraught area as well, right? You're basically you're changing the nature of humanity at that point. Do you know if people are contemplating that, what kind of experiments they have in mind?
I can recommend reading or looking at the work of Dr. Christopher Mason. He's a renowned expert in genome editing in a space context, in a space exploration context. And he's actually drafted like a roadmap for the next 500 years. Really interesting, and backed by solid science. And I know a little bit about his work, and he's by far not the only one looking at these options. We're also monitoring what's going on, and we expect and we predict that genome editing will be one of the key areas of change for humanity in every way, including space exploration.
And disease eradication and everything else.
For sure. And that's where it's
yeah.
going to start. I mean, apart from my own personal ethical hesitations and the legitimate ethical concerns that many other people have, I mean, are we like playing for God or any other holy institution or anything? Legitimate concerns. But if you look at history, well, actually, it's going to be really hard to find a technology that eventually has not been used.
Right.
Maybe by some group or country who cannot afford a lot of ethics, but they see an advantage and therefore they will use it. And genome editing has so many options and eradicating disease, as you mentioned, that's going to be accepted the first. As we expect. That's going to be ethically the most comfortable transition. But if you open the box of Pandora, you cannot close it anymore. And there will be other benefits that are going to be exploited.
So one of the things that you've touched on in some of your written material online is remote medical care. So one of the challenges, I mean, in your case, you're focused on the reproductive journey, but this would apply to anything. If you break an arm in orbit and you're alone, you need medical care. And so you would have to do it yourself, and you'd have to have, you would benefit from having people on Earth walk you through it or having equipment with you that can play the role of doctor. What do you see happening in that field when it comes to reproductive health?
Yes, we are actually what we do requires remote controlling of a biological process. The embryos that are developing inside our incubator, inside our life support system, is going to be controlled remotely. We are including micro cameras for transferring imagery data to the ground station, and that we use that feedback to adjust the climate controls or the humidity or things like this. So we are looking at those options certainly for what we do. And I see other developments, but I'm sorry, I cannot, at this moment, I don't have a lot of other areas I can tell about.
Elon Musk has made the point many times, and he's not the first. I mean, Stephen Hawking made the same point that we need to go beyond the cradle of Earth to other locations. How much importance do you attach to this idea of having backups for planet Earth, for the human race?
Yeah, it's crucial for the survival of the human species on the long term. There are quite a few risks, especially accumulated for real threats to human life on Earth. I like one of those quotes from Michio Kaku, the professor, and he says, "Why are there no dinosaurs on Earth? Because they didn't have a space program." and yeah, basically he's got a point. I mean, we can calculate statistically the odds that bigger comets asteroids will hit the Earth one day, and that's going to cause a lot of problems for potentially thousands of years.
Yeah,
there are 23 super volcanoes behind schedule, waiting to explode, causing ice ages for 1,000 years or more. But the most urgent threats are climate change and artificial intelligence in about 20 to 30 years could also go wrong. So I fully agree with anyone who is like Elon Musk. I think you should focus on both a backup plan. We need a backup plan, on the really, really long term, I mean, the sun is going to go through its life cycle and become a red giant and swallow the Earth. And before it swallows the Earth, all the water is going to be vaporized. So in a billion years, we need to have moved already.
Yes.
But that's a long term. But looking at all the other risks, a few backup plans would be a very good idea.
Yeah, I find the arguments of super volcanoes and large meteors or asteroids striking on the Earth, I find them pretty persuasive. I'm not as persuaded by the idea of AI, not because it isn't necessarily a threat if wielded incorrectly, but just that it would move to Mars too, right? That no matter what happens, we're going to be part of one big internet, and I can't see us being immune from that or from some horrific war or something like that. But from natural disasters, I think it's an important mitigation strategy. I agree with you there.
Yes, it's interesting you're indirectly talking about potential great filters. Maybe the human nature is just causing too much problems to become multiplanetary. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm more optimistic than that.
I'm optimistic. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah. Well, if we're around in 1,000 years, we'll find out, right?
Exactly.
One question I have, and I realize that neither one of us is a legal scholar, but it's still something that's interesting to think about. Someone born off the Earth, what nationality would they be? And I'm sure that it hinges a little bit on what vessel they're on, who their parents are, just like like maritime law. There must be some way of figuring this out. But what are your thoughts on this? When a child is first born, would they naturally be a resident of a country on Earth?
We had experts look into this because we find it funny, interesting, and space law experts said this is undecided. It's not very difficult to make a decision about it, like the similar decisions that you described that are already used if you go on a boat outside of a country or in an airplane, obviously. So it's going to be one of those options, and I don't have an opinion on which one is best, but we found it intriguing, and we have it. It's not decided yet, so it would be funny if we could do our mission and it would still not have decided yet. We
right.
should have a world citizen, or maybe it's going to require the Air Force or Space Force to set some kind of alien protocol to work, because it's going to be the first formal alien then, maybe.
Right. First immigrant to Earth.
Yeah.
Well, one way of addressing it, and I know you've done some work on this, is to come up with a new country in space, a new nationality in space. And the one effort that's underway is called Asgardia, which I don't believe is a reference to the Marvel movies, but rather to the original myths that the Marvel movies are in turn referring to. So can you talk a little bit about what Asgardia is all about?
Yes, I mean, there are, everybody knows those rich billionaires that like Elon Musk, Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, a few others, and they're all into building rockets and engineering, and they're doing great stuff. And there's this other very wealthy person who also is still very interested in space, but he had a different ambition. His ambition is to have the first space nation, as you were referring to, and the name of that nation is indeed Asgardia, and they actually have the ambition to be recognized by the United Nations. So they take it really, really seriously, and they're going through the steps that are required for that recognition. So you need to have a constitution, you need to have a functioning democratically chosen parliament. You need ministers, you need, well, all things like this, and they got a lot of them figured out and operational, and they have congresses, science and investment congresses, and things like this. And the funny thing is, the interesting thing is, besides this more like political ambition to be the first recognized nation, space nation, they also have a scientific vision and a scientific key goal of enabling the first childbirth in space. And that's clearly
the first natural born Asgardian.
Well, yeah, in fact, well, maybe even literally like this. They didn't explicitly say naturally born.
Well, when I say natural born, I mean not immigrating into the country of Asgardia, as we all would now, I presume.
And I mean, a natural birth is what we are aiming for as well. So that's a lot easier than waiting for the technology for artificial wombs to go into space. And so it's going to be natural anyway. But it's obvious that this is where we have a very strong match. So I was honored to be on their Congress and present on stage about our work. And then they invited me to become more intimate with them, and they're now preparing to support the research that we do, also financial support. I met a lot of interesting experts that are also joining the work that we do. But so that's what Asgardia is about, and that's how we have a match.
So you're sort of the off-world health organization.
Well,
sort of,
at least
right?
the reproduction
component. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm tempted to say that somebody needs to fill the vacuum, but Elon Musk is talking about putting 1 million people on Mars, and all he said really on the subject of how it would be run would be a bunch of plebiscites. Everybody would get to vote on everything. It would be an electronic democracy. But it seems like Asgardia has done a little more of a detailed thought on how things would work. But again, coming back to this idea of a vacuum, there's going to be multiple interests who would like to, if Mars turns out to be revenue positive, then I'm sure people are going to want to claim that as part of, the United States is a likely claimant. And of course, this is the stuff of science fiction, right? I'm not a huge fan of The Expanse. I don't watch it, but basically it's about Mars becoming a colony that is revenue positive and Earth not letting it be free. I mean, that's sort of the undercurrent of the whole thing. And what Asgardia seems to be doing is trying to get in front of that before the conflict arises. So even though it seems like a strange thing to be creating a country out of not even thin air, but no air, there is a purpose to it. It's worth thinking through in advance.
In that way, yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a very wise exercise to try to see, okay, well, what rules could be beneficial to humanity? What regulations do we need? And they're looking ahead in a healthy way, I believe. And still, that's absolutely no guarantee that's going to cover all the phenomena in human interaction that could happen. So in that way, I think it's a very healthy exercise to do indeed. And by the way, they do have a territory. It's a little bit of space law detail, but you need, if you want to be a country, you need a territory, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to allow for habitation. So they have a satellite in orbit that is declared legally as the territory of Asgardia. It's just your residents don't have to live there on the territory.
Thank goodness.
It would be practically really challenging. Yeah.
Yes. This has been fascinating. Thank you so much, Egbert. My last question is, when do you think the first human will be born in space?
I would say in 15 years from now.
15 years. Okay.
And I wouldn't be surprised if it will be sooner.
Fascinating. Okay, well, exciting times. So thank you so much for being on the show, Egbert. I appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
My guest today was Egbert Edelbroek. A link to Egbert's LinkedIn profile and his company SpaceBorn United will be in the show notes. My name is Tim Hampton. You can reach me at tim@unusuallywellinformed.com. Thanks for listening. I hope you will subscribe and join me for the next show with another unusually well-informed leader in business and technology.
Thank you for listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on the Unusually Well-Informed podcast are their own and do not reflect that of their employer or any other affiliation.